May I please court?
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to first thank you for the time and you've taken away from your lives to come down here and participate in this process. We spent a long time talking to you individually before each one of you were selected to come down here collectively and listen to the evidence in this case. I want to go back first and remind you of what we talked to you about when you were selected, talking about what it is that as jurors you have to come into this courtroom and do. And I told you that I felt comfortable that if you came in here with the intelligence and the common sense that you showed us as we were selecting you as jurors, we believe that you will do the right thing when you consider the evidence of the law in this case. And that's where the problem arises for the state in this case, is because they are actually guided by the law that you have received here from the court this morning. Now, we spoke in voir dire about how there is a presumption of innocence that follows any citizen accused of a crime, and that presumption certainly applies to Mr. Kristopher Love in this case. You have heard from his own words that he takes responsibilities for certain things that he did, and that is an opportunity in this court's charge to find him guilty of what he has told you. The state seeks now to come before you and say, well, no, he is guilty of the ultimate charge. And they seek to come in here and say, here is the reasons why you should find him guilty and take away that presumption of innocence, which each one of you told us that you would not do unless they could come in and convince you in a legal fashion by the law and by the evidence. Each one of you told us that you recognized that as you came into this courtroom, you would come in here as jurors and you would look to the state of Texas in their attempts to prove this case to you, and that you would not hold it upon the members of the defense team to try to prove the innocence of someone. Now, we've been working on this case for quite a while. I think you can see the amount of time and the effort that's been put into this case by all the parties. And there are certain things here that we just don't know for sure. Certain things that we just don't know for sure. And that's not unusual. That's not unusual in a criminal case. But you see, the burden in a criminal case, and certainly in a case of capital murder where the state seeks to come in here and ask you to find someone guilty of capital murder, you as jurors must be convinced beyond all reasonable doubt. Any and all reasonable doubts must be banished by the state's evidence before they are entitled to a verdict of guilty. And as I said earlier, it's the law itself that's going to cause the state problems in this case. I want to go back through and I want to read to you, and I'm going to ask you when you go back there. I know the court read this to you, but you'll have copies that you can take back there and you can look at it and look at the law, because this is what has to guide you when you go back there and consider this case. The state of Texas comes through here and they present their evidence and they say, look at this piece of evidence. This is what it means. This is what it is. Well, it doesn't mean anything, and it's not anything unless you review it and you decide what meaning you want to give it as a jury. But the law specifically tells you in this case, because we are talking about, in order to find the defendant guilty in this case, the state is relying upon accomplice testimony. And you are told that as a matter of law, Crystal Cortez is an accomplice in this case. You are guided by the law here, and it says that you are charged. That is, you are instructed by law that Crystal Cortez was an accomplice in this offense if one was committed, and that you are instructed that you cannot find the defendant guilty. Now listen to that, that's the law. You cannot find the defendant guilty upon the testimony of Crystal Cortez unless you first believe that her testimony is true. You must first believe her testimony is true. And that is where the state has problems in this case. Because we've heard the stories. We have two divergent stories about how this occurred. And you've heard the background. It's a little unusual in a capital murder case where we go almost a day and a half of testimony before you ever hear the name of the defendant brought up in this case. But we have a situation here in this case where you had an opportunity to hear the backdrop. You heard from a lot of folks that have never, I asked a couple, have you ever heard the name Kristopher Love? No, I don't know nothing about none of this. But you heard the backdrop of Brenda Delgado. You heard how she went around trying to find somebody to hurt. And again, the prosecution's theory in this case is that this was always about killing, but that's not what the witnesses testified to. But Brenda Delgado was in the process of trying to find somebody before she even met Crystal Cortez. And she was unable to do so. They kept going, and went through Jennifer Calderon, eventually to Crystal Cortez, and Crystal Cortez is the backbone of the state's case in here. And you are absolutely entitled, because when you are told that you cannot convict somebody unless you believe somebody's testimony is true, you are absolutely entitled, and you're required to go back and ask yourself, what would be the motivation of that person to lie? Well, there's certainly no more motivation than Crystal Cortez has. She sat here on the witness stand, and it took about 2 minutes of questioning before she finally just backed down and admitted that she was absolutely unworthy of belief in any fashion. She has told 100 different stories about this. I asked the detective, is it not in fact true that you would pull her out of the jail cell from the day she was arrested and you questioned her for hours upon a time? And as I spent many nights sitting in my room with the headphones on, transcribing one lie after the next, I come into this courtroom having no idea of what she was going to say until the state comes in and says, here's the notes. This is her version of what she's going to say now. And yet they come before you and sponsor that testimony and say, look, she's telling the truth. Well, no, folks, I submit to you that she's not. Crystal Cortez is in here saving her butt. Saving her butt in the fate that she deserves. And she got it. She got it. State says, hey, we'll give you a virtual slap on the wrist in this case. Because we need you to come in here and appear believable in front of these 12 people that are going to decide this case. And if you've heard all the discrepancies, every story she told, everything makes no sense. And it persisted all the way up until this year, a couple of weeks ago. And we know that as she got on this witness stand, she continues to lie to you. She continues to lie and do whatever she has to do to manipulate not only these folks, because they haven't signed off on her deal yet. They just promised it. But see, they got to make sure that, number one, she comes in here and gets him convicted, and then they're going to dance her up in front of Brenda Delgado and see if she can use those puppet strings to convict her. And she'll say or do anything that she has to. That story will change however it needs to change for her to accomplish what she wants, and that's to save Crystal Cortez. The detective said on the video when he was speaking to the defendant, he said, look, son, the truth of the matter is you've been played. And he was played. And he told you, and folks, you will go back there and you'll make the decision. But if you're guided by the principles of the law says that you cannot convict him of capital murder unless you believe that Crystal Cortez's testimony is true. And it proves that he committed the crime. Not that a crime was committed, but that he committed the crime. And what he told the detective was, yeah, I signed up for a robbery. And if you think about it, that makes sense, doesn't it? If the goal, as it was explained to him, was to prevent her from being able to go get on an airplane, get her purse, get her ID. She can't get on an airplane. Okay? That's what he told the detective. You're going to may go back and you're going to decide who to believe, but you have charged by the law that you cannot convict unless you believe Crystal Cortez. So it's not a situation where you go back and say, well, we're not sure what to do. We'll go ahead and convict. The law protects the rights of the citizen accused. And you're told that you cannot do that. Crystal Cortez has sat there and just played a game. She's played a game throughout this entire process. And she persisted all the way up until the time as I questioned her. And you'll notice, if you recall, that she denied it. But I said, Crystal, isn't it really true that you sat here and the only reason that you come in here now telling this story is because your lawyer has informed you that he is accusing you of being the one who pulled the trigger. And finally, she said, yeah, that's what it is. Crystal Cortez will do whatever it takes to please them, please you. And we're going to ask that you follow the law, and you go back there and you ask yourself that threshold question. Can we go back there and say that we believe the testimony of Crystal Cortez? Now, you have the story that the defendant told the detective, that he signed up and agreed to take in a robbery. And why is that important? Because I asked Crystal about this, and I asked the detective about this also. Because really, if Chris was supposed to be the instrumentality of death in this situation, why do we have Crystal Cortez admitting that she's over there that day to do it herself? Whatever was supposed to be done, she's telling everybody all the way up, and even when he's in custody. I was over there myself. And then she gets up here on the witness stand and tells you, yeah, well, I was going to be the one that pulled the trigger. Now think about that. Think about that for a second. We were discussing who was going to pull the trigger, and said, well, I'll do it since you know your way around. Does that make sense, folks? Does that really make sense? Crystal Cortez was the one that had been in on this planning well before Christopher Love's name ever came up. And she told you she was ready, willing, and able to be the one to do the deed. But then she wants to say, oh, well, Chris said he'll go ahead and do it so I can drive. And we can see some things on that video. The state says, well, Mr. Johnson's going to get up here and make a big deal about this 45 seconds. Well, folks, I am. Because I've had an opportunity to watch that video 100 times. And there's a whole lot of things you can't see. They say, well, the car couldn't have stopped because another car was there. Oh, there's a parking garage. There's a lot of places for it to stop. What happened in those 45 seconds? The defendant told the detective that, yeah, after I'd already got back in the car, I'd already snatched the purse, I got back into the car. And it was sometime after that. He said, I don't know, I guess she jumped out then. Could it have been 10 seconds later? 15 seconds later? Could Crystal Cortez have been there to do and finish what she was going to do to please Brenda Delgado? Well, you go back there and you look at that videotape, and if it proves to you that she didn't, then so be it. But you can't. You can't, because it's not on there. The state says, well, look over here. There's a mysterious, faint white dot that you lose sight of for 1 second. Well, that's an attempt to try to make something out of the darkness. That's an attempt to try to convince you about something that you can't see, but that they have a theory for, and they'll get Crystal Cortez to come in here and paint you a picture of what occurred in the darkness. The law tells you you can't do it unless you believe she's being truthful. So what happened in that 45 seconds? I don't know. You've heard my client say he don't know. He said that he was back in the car. At some point, Kristopher Cortez got out and was the one who inflicted the wound. State says, well, she would have had to have shot through the car and the bullet flew. No, she could have stepped right out of that vehicle and shot it. Turned that vehicle around and came out. But the bottom line is, folks, you have to decide what's been proven in this courtroom beyond all reasonable doubt. I don't know what Mr. Brooks is going to say. He's going to get up here, and I tried to look at his notes before he argued, and he turned his pad over. And he's going to get up, and he'll say things like, well, Mr. Johnson didn't mention this or that. But I can promise you, he can't say anything that I can't respond to, because there's no way anybody in this courtroom can know the truth. And unless you know it, unless you are convinced beyond all reasonable doubt that you do, you have to be guided by the law that the court gives you. And the law regarding accomplice testimony controls. Absolutely controls. And again, don't confuse corroboration for just them saying, well, look, here's the crime. The crime was committed. The corroboration has to be that the defendant committed that act. You'll be guided again if you go back and you look at this charge closely on page 6, because you're given two choices in this charge. One of them is what the state is asking for, and that is a verdict of guilty of capital murder. The second one tells you that the defendant can be found guilty of robbery if you have a reasonable doubt about your consideration of the issue on capital murder. And again, folks, we spent a lot of time, 2 months picking this jury. And we ask every one of you, would you be guided by the principles of law? Would you be guided by those principles, even if it was the most difficult decision you ever had to make? And every one of you told us yes. Page 6 says, if you should find from the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the charged offense of capital murder or the lesser included offense of robbery, but you have a reasonable doubt about which offense he is guilty of, then you should resolve that doubt in the defendant's favor and find him guilty of the lesser included offense of robbery. Now, folks, as I said earlier, and I told you, we put our trust in you. We put our trust in you to make the right decision in this case. I'm going to ask you, you go back, you review this court's charge. You go back, you review the evidence in this case. You go back, and when you have finished your search and your quest to determine what law and what facts are believable in this case, you make the decision that you believe is appropriate based upon your oath in this case. Thank you.